There's a certain stillness in the forest at night, a quiet so deep it can make you feel utterly alone. But sometimes, when the silence stretches too thin, it feels like something is listening. That's how it began for me, in an A-frame cabin tucked into the dense woods of northern Washington. My family, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Grandpa, and I, had planned a peaceful getaway. The days were spent boating on the shimmering lake, laughing around the fire, and relishing the escape from the chaos of life. The cabin, with its towering glass windows overlooking the forest and lake, was the perfect retreat. One afternoon, my family decided to make a run to a convenience store, a good 30 to 45 minutes down the winding dirt road. I opted to stay behind, savoring the tranquility of the cabin alone. It felt like a great idea at first. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake in hues of gold and orange, I wandered through the cabin, enjoying the solitude. The enormous windows framed the sunset like a masterpiece, but as dusk settled, those same windows transformed into portals to an abyss of darkness. I was lost in the stillness when I saw it, a faint movement near the dock, about 125 meters away. My eyes locked onto the shadowy edge of the forest. It was subtle, just a flicker, like something or someone had slipped behind a tree. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. After all, the forest was teeming with wildlife. But as night swallowed the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The once cozy retreat felt oppressive, the kind of silence that hums with hidden tension. The rain began to patter against the roof, soft at first, then steady, a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. I tried to distract myself, moving from room to room, but the feeling was inescapable, that creeping sense that I wasn't alone. When I went to the bathroom down the narrow hallway, the uneasiness hit me full force. The door shut with a quiet click, cutting me off from the vast windows, from the forest, from whatever might be out there. As I stood there, an overwhelming feeling of being watched took root in my chest. I convinced myself I was imagining things, and forced myself out of the bathroom, back toward the living room. I peered through the massive windows. The forest was a wall of shadows, the lake eerily still under the pale moonlight. And then I felt it, a primal, gut-wrenching certainty. I wasn't just being watched, I was being studied. When I turned around, my blood froze. At the end of the hallway, just beyond the glass door, stood a figure. It was a deer, or at least it looked like one. But it wasn't on all fours. It stood upright, its head tilted unnaturally, as if it were trying to mimic human curiosity. My brain screamed at me to move, to look away, but I couldn't. It was wrong, grotesque, its dark eyes boring into mine. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Instead, I stumbled backward, turned, and bolted to the bathroom. I slammed the door, locked it, and crouched in the corner, shaking. The rain tapped against the roof, a haunting metronome to my racing heart. Minutes felt like hours. I didn't dare move, listening for footsteps, for anything. Then faintly, I heard the sound of the car engine. My family was back. Even then, I hesitated to leave the safety of the bathroom. When I finally did, the hallway was empty, the glass door untouched. My family bustled inside, their laughter and chatter breaking the oppressive silence. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. What could I say that wouldn't sound insane? The next morning, we searched the area. There were no tracks by the dock, no signs of anything near the cabin. But that didn't erase what I had seen or felt. To this day, I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if something truly unnatural was watching me that night. What I do know is the terror was real, and I'll never forget those dark, unblinking eyes. Sometimes the forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes it lets them out just long enough to remind you that you're not alone. There's a peculiar stillness in the forest at night. It's not the kind of peace you'd find comforting. It's the kind that creeps under your skin, the kind that amplifies every sound, every shadow, and every whisper of the wind until it feels like the trees themselves are watching. When I think back to that night, the memories don't come in neat, orderly pieces. They come in fragments. Rushed breaths, the cold press of the earth beneath my knees, the weight of dread so tangible it felt like I could choke on it. I've recounted this story countless times, but even now, the details send a shiver down my spine. I wasn't always a fan of the wilderness. In fact, I hated it. Growing up, my parents sent me to summer camps in Colorado every year. They thought it would build character, but to me, it was a week-long sentence. The heavy packs, the lack of toilets, the spiders that somehow always ended up inside my sleeping bag, it wasn't for me. When I turned 16, I became a counselor in training, thinking it might change my perspective. After all, the stories about these trips were alluring: late-night drinking, sneaking off to smoke weed, and maybe a hookup or two after the campers fell asleep. I thought this trip would be different, that it would finally redeem camping in my eyes. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The day started innocently enough. There were about 30 of us in total, 20 campers aged 13 to 14, 4 senior counselors, and 4 of us counselors in training. We hiked in single file, the kids' chatter bouncing off the trees and drowning out the usual forest sounds. Hours passed as we trudged through the dense, marshy trails and climbed up a steep incline lined with aspens and evergreens. I wasn't in the best shape, so I fell to the back of the group along with Jordan, another counselor in training, and 2 straggling campers. The forest seemed alive in the daytime, buzzing with insects and the rustle of leaves. But as the main group disappeared around a bend, the atmosphere shifted. It started subtly. The trees thinned out, their branches gnarled and blackened as if they'd been scorched in a wildfire. The air grew heavy, quiet, too quiet. It felt as though the forest itself had stopped breathing. That's when we saw it. The cabin was derelict, sitting alone in the middle of the dead forest like something out of a horror movie. Its wooden planks were gray with age, but strangely, it seemed untouched by the fire that had ravaged the surrounding trees. We stopped in our tracks. One of the campers let out a startled yelp when a twig snapped behind us. Jordan and I laughed nervously, but the laughter died in our throats when we turned around. About 20 feet down the trail stood a man. His tangled nest of black hair and long, unkempt beard made him look more like a creature than a person. His clothes were worn and filthy, and he carried nothing. No pack, no water bottle, nothing to suggest he was hiking. He didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes locked onto us, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. "Let's catch up to the group," Jordan muttered, forcing a smile as he gave the man a small wave. We turned and started walking, but the man's voice stopped us. "Going camping?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Jordan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." The man's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "Better be careful." We didn't need to be told twice. Without looking back, we quickened our pace, the weight of his stare pressing on us like a physical force. When we finally caught up with the group, we told the senior counselors about the man. They dismissed our concerns, saying he probably lived in the cabin and was just curious. But his smile and the way his gaze lingered stayed with me. That night, after we set up camp, Jordan and another counselor in training snuck over to my tent with a couple of warm drinks they'd swiped. I pulled out a joint I'd been saving, and we decided to head to the riverbank to hang out. The spot was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every sound feel amplified. I couldn't shake the image of the man in the woods, and Jordan must have noticed my unease. He handed me his hoodie and cracked a joke about switching tents so I could sleep with him instead. We spent a while smoking, drinking, and sharing ghost stories. At first it was fun, the kind of harmless spookiness that makes you laugh. But then, as the stories got darker, the atmosphere shifted. One of the boys was midway through his tale when he stopped. his voice trailing off. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. We strained our ears. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching on pine needles coming from the direction of the tents. "It's probably just one of the campers," Jordan said, but his voice was tight. We decided to call it a night, nerves already frayed. As we walked back, I stuck close to Jordan, comforted by his presence. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps near my tent. They were close, too close, pacing back and forth just a few feet from the entrance. My heart pounded as I tried to stay still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped. Then, the zipper of the tent slowly slid open. Relief washed over me when Jordan slipped inside and lay down beside me. He wrapped an arm around me and I let myself relax, the fear ebbing away as I drifted back to sleep. But something woke me again. This time it wasn't the footsteps, it was a question. "Have you seen my blue hoodie?" I turned to see Jordan standing outside the tent, flashlight in hand. My mind reeled. "You were just wearing it," I stammered. Jordan's face twisted in confusion. "I haven't been in the tent since we came back from the river." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The person who had been lying next to me wasn't Jordan. We rushed back to the tent, Jordan's flashlight cutting through the darkness. As the beam hit the nylon, we froze. A shadow, a distinct outline of a man lying still inside. Jordan screamed. The rest of the night was a blur. We woke the senior counselors who searched the tent, but it was empty. Our gear was scattered, as if someone had left in a hurry. At sunrise, we packed up and hiked back to camp, flanked by armed staff who had been called in for protection. Along the trail, one of the campers found Jordan's blue hoodie tied around a tree. We left it there, a silent reminder of the shadow that had invaded our sanctuary. Even now, years later, I can't say for sure what happened that night, but the memory of the man's smile, the footsteps, and the cold presence in the tent will haunt me forever. The 4th of July weekend in 2011 was supposed to be a simple getaway, a break from the city's chaos and a chance to unwind in the quiet embrace of the woods. My buddy Troy's cabin stood nestled in the dense forest like a lone sentinel, surrounded by towering trees that whispered secrets in the breeze. But this trip was destined to be anything but peaceful. Troy had gone all out, inviting a small group of friends to his family's secluded cabin. He was eager to introduce me to someone he thought I'd hit it off with, a girl whose name I'd never heard before, but who, he assured me, would change my life. The promise of a weekend filled with barbecue, beer, and star-filled skies was enough to pull me in. But as I look back now, I realize how naive I was to believe it would all go as planned. When we first arrived, everything seemed perfect. Troy's introductions proved spot on, and the girl, let's call her Sarah, was just as he described, charming, easygoing, and fun to be around. The cabin was a cozy little place, its wooden walls emanating a faint scent of pine and memories. The first few hours were light-hearted. Sarah and I quickly clicked, and before long, we found ourselves alone downstairs, lost in conversation that seemed to blur time. Upstairs, Troy was hosting the rest of the group. Laughter and music drifting through the wooden floorboards like a distant memory of simpler days. But then, it started. A murmur of unfamiliar voices reached my ears, faint but distinct. At first I thought nothing of it, probably more friends arriving late. But curiosity got the better of me and I excused myself, climbing the creaky wooden stairs. As I emerged into the main room, my stomach dropped. There he was, Ace. Troy stood by the doorway with a grin, his arms slung around Ace like they were long-lost brothers. My blood ran cold. Ace wasn't just an old acquaintance. He was a problem, a lingering shadow of bad blood and bitter memories. "What the hell is he doing here?" I growled, my voice low but sharp. Troy, taken aback by my hostility, tried to diffuse the tension. "Relax, man. It's just for the weekend. Let's bury the hatchet. But burying the hatchet wasn't in my nature, not with Ace. The sight of him standing there, smug and self-assured, ignited a fire I couldn't contain. The cabin became a pressure cooker, and Troy and I were the sparks. Heated words flew, echoing off the wooden walls. Ace, clearly uncomfortable, lingered near the doorway, his presence adding fuel to the fire. The argument escalated until Troy's girlfriend appeared, her expression a mix of confusion and unease. In my frustration, I stormed upstairs wearing nothing but my boxers, oblivious to how absurd I must have looked. I dragged Troy back downstairs, determined to settle things in private. Eventually, tempers cooled. To ease the tension, Troy decided to take his girlfriend and Ace for a night swim at the creek. It was a small concession, a chance to clear the air, or so I thought. But then, I realized something that made my blood boil all over again. Troy had taken my shorts. Inside were my wallet, keys, and smokes, essentials I couldn't afford to lose. When Troy returned, I confronted him immediately. He refused to strip down in front of everyone, brushing off my anger with a laugh. Ace, ever the instigator, jumped into the argument, his tone condescending and sarcastic. I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to escalate things further. The night dragged on, uneventful but tense. Troy and his girlfriend left again, this time without Ace. They didn't return. Morning came, and the unease settled deeper into my bones. Troy still hadn't come back. At first I shrugged it off, assuming they'd stayed out late or crashed at a nearby spot. But by the second night, the silence was deafening. I called Troy's girlfriend repeatedly, but her phone went straight to voicemail. By the third day, panic gripped me like a vice. Something was wrong. Frantic, I called a few friends to join me at the cabin. Together, we combed the woods, shouting Troy's name into the endless expanse of trees. The creek, the trails, even the overgrown paths leading deeper into the forest, nothing. He had vanished, leaving behind only questions and a gnawing sense of dread. Desperation led us to report Troy missing. His girlfriend, finally reachable, sounded confused and alarmed. She claimed she'd assumed Troy had returned to the cabin. Her voice trembled as I recounted the past 3 days. When the authorities arrived, the narrative shifted. I was the last person to see Troy alive. We'd argued, a fact no one could deny, and my reputation as a hothead painted a damning picture. Detectives questioned me relentlessly, their eyes boring into me as if they could unearth the truth by sheer force of will. Then they dropped the bombshell. They'd found clothes near the hot tub with traces of blood. I was stunned. The discovery only deepened their suspicion, and I could feel the walls closing in. The fourth day brought an unexpected turn. The low hum of helicopter blades cut through the tense air, growing louder as it approached. We all stepped outside, craning our necks to see what was happening. Suspended beneath the chopper in a rescue harness was Troy, his body limp and pale, dangling like a ghost between life and death. He was alive. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. Questions remained unanswered, and the weight of the past few days lingered like a storm cloud. In the days that followed, the truth emerged in fragments. Troy's girlfriend had stolen his debit card before their walk. An argument had erupted, and they'd separated in the woods. She'd found her way back to the road, leaving Troy behind to fend for himself. For 2 days, she'd partied with his money, ignoring his calls and turning off her phone. By the time she finally answered, Troy was on the brink of death. The forest had nearly claimed him. Exposure and dehydration had left him fragile, but he survived, a testament to sheer will and the relentless efforts of search and rescue. Troy and I never spoke again. The bonds that once held our friendship together were irreparably frayed, unraveling in the wake of those harrowing days. I moved out of state, seeking distance from the memories that haunted me. The cabin, once a symbol of camaraderie and escape, became a monument to betrayal and survival. Some memories fade with time, but others linger, etched into the soul like scars. The 4th of July weekend in 2011 was meant to be a celebration, but for those of us who lived through it, it became a chilling reminder of how quickly things can unravel when shadows creep into the light.